This week's parashah covers Numbers chapter 30 right through to 32. But we only read chapter 30 because I want to focus on that one chapter today and compare it with our other readings from the Brit Hadashah particularly. Also, I want to see if we can gain a deeper appreciation of what Yhvh was telling the people of Israel, particularly the leaders at that stage, about making a vow or an oath to Yhvh. Firstly, he speaks to the men. The parashah begins in verse 2, where Moshe is speaking to the heads of the tribes of Israel, and he says, "Here is what Yhvh has ordered when a man makes a vow to Yhvh, or formally obligates himself by swearing an oath. He is not to break his word, but to do everything he has said he would do." Now, there's nothing ambiguous about that statement. Either a vow or an oath to Yhvh is never to be broken. So is there any real difference between a vow and an oath? The dictionary says a vow is a solemn pledge to oneself or to another person or to a deity. In this particular case, it's to Yhvh. To do something or behave in a certain manner. An oath is a solemn promise, usually invoking a divine witness regarding a future act or some behavior in the future. So either statement, when made, imposes an obligation on the person to act or behave in a manner that is keeping with the pledge or the promise that is made. There is no room for compromise or reversal. Next, we look at what was said to the woman. Starting in verse 4, we see that the woman could make a vow, and that she was also obligated to keep that vow. However, her husband or her father could void that vow if whoever she was with expressed disapproval within 1 day. The man who's responsible for voiding her vow could only be either her father if she was a virgin or her husband if she was married. However, a woman who is a widow or a divorcee was always obligated to keep the vow that she'd made, as no male has responsibility or headship over her. Therefore, whatever she vows or makes as an oath stands against her or with her all the time. Now, is there a deeper significance to these things? Why did Yhvh instruct Moshe to make these rulings on the plains of Moab? It's just a few weeks before they are ready to cross the Jordan River into Canaan. Why was he now instructing this second generation, where most of the Torah was actually given at Mount Horeb to the first generation? So why wasn't this brought up at that stage? Perhaps there's a deeper meaning hidden behind the words of chapter 30. Is Yhvh saying something far more profound than we see in this first reading? In answering that question, we need to recognize the fact that in Jewish thought there are 4 levels of exegesis. That means interpretation of the scriptures. It's known as Pardes, which comprises 4 levels. Level 1 is the literal or direct meaning of the text as it's found in the first reading. Level 2 suggests that the text may be construed as something symbolic of something that's not stated. Level 3, the text compares directly with another similar text somewhere else in Scripture. In level 4, there's likely to be a profound message hidden away in the text which is not visible when we first read it. Now, I believe chapter 30 has that deep-seated 4th level, the meaning of which I will attempt to expose. It may also explain why Yhvh gave that mitzvah to Moshe in the second generation instead of giving it to him earlier when he was at Mount Horeb. Now firstly, if we cast our minds back to Exodus chapter 19, at the time when they first arrived at Mount Horeb, we see when they got there, Moshe went up the mountain into the presence of Yhvh, and he was instructed what the people were to do before Yhvh came down on the mountain in fire. He was told to summon the leaders of all Israel, and he told them all the things they were to do to prepare over the next 3 days before Yhvh came to their presence. In response, all the people said in verse 8 of chapter 19, "Everything Yhvh has said we will do." That was a vow. They committed themselves. Those words of the people were a vow directly to Yhvh, and all Israel, both men and women, who were standing there before Yhvh, said those words. That was before they received the 10 words from the top of the mountain. However, immediately after receiving those 10 words, the same people in chapter 20 verse 16 said, "You, Moshe, speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die." That was a reversal of what they'd said. After that, Moshe went back up the mountain for 40 days and received the tablets and the rest of the words of Torah. But of course, while he was away, they all lost trust. And what did they do? They built the golden calf. That was their first reversal of the vow they'd made to Yhvh. The calf incident, of course, was later followed by more reversals of that initial vow. When the 10 spies came back from reconnoitering the land, they brought back bad reports. Korach, along with 250 others, mounted a rebellion against Yhvh and Aaron, and of course ultimately against Yhvh himself. Then, as a direct result of all those rebellions and the backsliding and the complaining that had been going on for so long, their vows were virtually meaningless. They had gone back on everything they committed themselves to. As a result, because of their contempt for Yhvh, and because of the way they treated Moshe and Aaron, that first generation all died out in the wilderness. So let's look at why there's a different ruling for men and for women in terms of vows. In chapter 30, Yhvh is singling out women of the second generation and allowing their vows to be voided by their father or husband. And if a man disapproves of what she had vowed, he can rescind it. On the surface, there appears to be no logical reason why the women of that second generation should be any different from the women of the first generation. Because the first generation made vows, both men and women, and they were all held guilty of when they turned their backs on their vows. Had something changed? Let's dig a little deeper and see if there is anything else in those words as to why a period of 1 day was provided in which a woman's vow could be reversed. Now in verses 4 through 16, it's the woman's husband who has just 1 day in which to express his disapproval. Otherwise, her vow becomes permanent and binding. What about the disapproving husband or father? Is it possible that Yhvh is expressing his disapproval about his people Israel by showing through these words that he himself will act as a husband, as a disapproving husband, to Israel sometime in the future? We know from the moment that they left Egypt they were constantly expressing contempt towards the rulership of Yhvh. Firstly, their contempt was directly towards Moshe and Aaron, and even afterwards, after they'd crossed the Jordan River, they kept on turning their backs on Yhvh and the Torah and the teachings of the leaders, and followed Baal and other forms of worship. As we read a few weeks back, right through the period of the life of Yehoshua and right through the period of Judges, they were constantly turning away from Yhvh, constantly breaking their vows and turning to other gods. Yhvh had every justification for terminating their sojourn in the land of promise. So did he invoke that same rule that he placed upon the women of Israel by acting as a disapproving husband himself. When we consider the time Israel and Yhvh had spent in Eretz Israel, we see that the time between departing Egypt and the destruction of the first temple was a period of 906 years. Remember, Adam died after 930 years. So in both cases, the period is just a few years short of 1,000 years, or one creative day. Yhvh always dwelt among his people from the time of the building of the Mishkan at Mount Horeb until the departure of the glory of God from the temple of Israel, as we saw in the readings from Ezekiel. He was always present. However, because of their corrupt practices, the 10 tribes were taken into exile by Assyria, and they have never returned. But later, Yhvh was taken into Babylon. And all that occurred from the time of leaving Egypt until the time of the destruction of the first temple and those exiles, all occurred in one creative day, 1,000-year period. Is that possibly a greater fulfillment of the one-day window which the woman's husband could void her vow? Remember, at Mount Horeb, Yhvh married his people, Israel. So he was their husband. So he had the right to rescind the vows that they were making if he saw it was inappropriate. Because if Israel had kept constantly turning their backs on Yhvh by seeking Baal and other gods of the nations, they reached a point where he actually evicted them by using the Gentile nations themselves to carry out his work. Firstly, the 10 tribes were taken by Assyria, and later Yhvh was taken by Babylon. If Yhvh had allowed Israel to remain longer than 906 years, if he had allowed them to stay over 1,000 years, that one-day window, it would have passed the point where the vow could be reversed. It would have been impossible, having made the edict, for him to remove his people from the land. Bear in mind that all the way through there is this interplay between Yhvh and Satan in the background. Everything that Yhvh makes as an edict, Satan is constantly reminding him. Yhvh is the king of Israel, so he has to abide by his edicts. He can't reverse anything once he's made an edict. So, return from Babylon. When Yhvh returned Eretz Israel when Yhvh returned to Eretz Israel and built the second temple, the glory of God never came back. That inner space, the inner sanctum of the second temple, was always empty. There was no Ark of the Covenant, and the glory of God was not present. Yhvh only sent Yhvh back to the land so that Yeshua could be born in Bethlehem, as foretold by the prophets. The marriage covenant Yhvh had made at Mount Horeb is later spoken about as the Old Covenant. This is spoken about by Yhvh, particularly in Hebrews chapter 8. And that is the one that was broken by Israel. As Yhvh explains throughout the book of Hebrews, the Old Covenant had to make way for the New Covenant, the one that was ratified by the death and resurrection of Yeshua. So let's look at Yeshua and the New Covenant. Once Yeshua had ratified the New Covenant, he set about establishing a bride for himself. They became the first century Messianic community, also known as the one new man. And he has been continuously adding to that first Messianic community right through the last 2,000 years. That body is destined to take up the role that was intended for Israel when they stood at Mount Horeb. They were to become a kingdom of priests. But because they were ejected from Eretz Israel, it was necessary to find a replacement body, which of course is the Messianic community. When I say replacement, it's from within Israel itself, not bringing the Gentiles in to replace Israel, as many would have us believe. He always had a remnant from Israel themselves. And as we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2, Yhvh spoke about how he was actually preparing the Messianic community as a pure virgin bride, ready for her husband, Yeshua, the Messiah. The Messianic community is now a direct reflection of what Israel was meant to have been following their marriage to Yhvh at Mount Horeb. That brings us to the words of Yhvh in Romans chapter 11, where he again speaks about the comparison between the Messianic community and the people of Israel who stood there at Mount Horeb. And he reminds his audience in verse 7, what follows is that Israel had not attained the goal for which she was striving, but the ones chosen have attained it, but the rest have been made stone-like. Then he continues in verse 11 saying, isn't it that they, Israel, have stumbled with the result that they are permanently fallen away? What's the answer? Heaven forbid. Quite the contrary. It means that their stumbling brought deliverance to the Gentiles, so that they, the Gentiles, may provoke the Jews to jealousy. Yhvh develops the illustration, of course, of the two olive trees, which we read about in verses 16 through 24. One is the cultivated olives, and the other is the wild. That's when the Gentiles enter the picture. Those of the first century Jewish community who had rejected Yeshua, the Messiahship of Yeshua, Yhvh is likening them to branches that are broken off from the cultivated olive, and they're lying on the ground. They are not eternally lost. Like their forefathers in the first temple time, the first century unbelieving Jews were set aside for a period until the Gentiles whom Yeshua would be selecting were brought into the Messianic community. The Gentiles being grafted in is very similar to the grafting in that took place at Mount Horeb, when the mixed multitude grafted into and adopted into one of the 12 tribes of Israel. However, that mixed multitude that was gathered at Mount Horeb all died in the wilderness except for one man. That first generation never entered the land of Canaan. That one man who did survive was Caleb, the one who brought back a good report after spying out the land. He was a Kenizi, a Gentile people group who are first mentioned in Genesis chapter 15, verse 19, when Yhvh was making the covenant with Abraham. He spoke about the 10 nations that were to be evicted when Israel returned to the land. Just as Yhvh set aside the greater majority of Israel from fulfilling the role as a priestly nation, so also Yhvh is going to bring an end to the ingathering of Gentiles to the Messianic community. Just as Yhvh removed Israel from the land within one creative day, so also Yhvh, in his own words, will bring an end to this age. As he said in Yhvh chapter 2, verse 19, Yhvh answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." The Judeans said, "Look, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he was speaking about was his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, the Talmudim remembered that he had said this, and they trusted the Tanakh and Yhvh. But when we look behind those words and think about what Yhvh was saying, it was not only speaking about his own body, he was also speaking of a long-term time frame. 3 days, 3,000 years. Within that period, in the 3rd day, he's going to raise up the temple. We've had nearly 2,000 years now. He is going to raise that temple after his return. And of course, who has he been gathering through that period? His bride. And who are his bride to be? The priests ministering at that new temple. So we see behind the scenes of the words, behind the initial appearance of the words, is a subtle and deeper meaning. So in conclusion, we have seen from Numbers chapter 30 and our other readings, there can be a deeper message than what appears at the first reading. Many words of Torah and the prophets have greater meaning and also point forward to the fulfillment by Yhvh and his Messianic community. We have seen how Israel has been set apart or set aside for a period until the Messianic community has been fully developed, and Yhvh or Yhvh can bring together the whole one new man of both Jews and Gentiles. We have also seen that Yhvh, when he entered into a marriage covenant with Israel, it was for a prolonged period, but because they violated that marriage relationship, he set them aside for a period, not for eternity, as many would suggest, but rather so that some could be brought in from the Gentile world, and a remnant of people of Israel could be brought together to form the Messianic community. All who had a part in the mixed multitude of Gentiles who came out of Egypt stood alongside the family of Yaakov, and those Gentiles were grafted into one of the 12 tribes at the foot of Mount Horeb. In the same manner, all the Gentiles who've been called by Yhvh have been grafted into, not the 12 tribes, but into the Messianic community, which is part of the national life of Israel. And as part of the Messianic community, we will be the priests who will serve in that 3rd temple. As Yhvh showed through Hebrews chapter 8, the Messianic community will become that new priesthood, with Yhvh as the Kohen HaGadol, the great high priest. However, after a long struggle to regain their relationship with Yhvh, all Israel will be brought back together, back into the marriage relationship that they once enjoyed with their God. Then, when the restoration by Yhvh is complete, the words of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 28 will be fulfilled. Now, when everything has been subjected to the Son, then he will subject himself to God, who subjected everything to him, so that God may be everything in everyone. And finally, the encouraging words from Ezekiel. Yhvh made yet another promise in Ezekiel 37, verses 26 to 28. I will make a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting covenant. I will give them and increase their numbers, and I will set my sanctuary among them forever. My home will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. The nations will know that I am Yhvh, who set Israel apart as holy, when my sanctuary is with them forever. Those promises Yhvh holds for the future of Israel, and of course the whole of mankind. Shabbat Shalom.